Sometimes, the most broken hearts recognize each other across a crowded auction yard. In the dusty cattle town of Dry Creek, a paint mare named Willow stands with her head hung low, branded as barren and worthless by men who never looked past the surface. Elias Boone, a widowed cowboy barely scraping by on his small ranch, sees something different in her tired eyes. Something that reminds him of his own loneliness since his wife passed 3 winters ago. When he places the winning bid of $30, the other ranchers shake their heads at the old fool buying damaged goods. But Willow carries a secret that will change everything. 2 starving foals have been following her scent for days, desperate to find their mother who was torn from them and left for dead. When they finally arrive at Elias's barn, the reunion brings tears to the weathered cowboy's eyes. What happens when the greedy rancher who sold her discovers the truth about Willow's foals? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elias Boone's weathered face as he guided Willow through the gate of his small ranch. The paint mare moved with cautious steps, her hooves crunching softly on the packed earth that had been home to generations of horses before her. Every few yards, she would pause and turn her head, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Elias understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. 3 years had passed since Sarah's funeral, yet he still caught himself setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table each morning. The gold band on his weathered finger caught the light Sarah's wedding ring, which he'd worn alongside his own since the day they buried her. Some nights, when the loneliness pressed down like a physical weight, he would twist the ring around his finger and remember the sound of her voice calling his name from the garden. His ranch, nestled in a valley between rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak, had once echoed with Sarah's laughter. Now it stood quiet, except for the wind through the cottonwoods and the occasional lowing of his small herd of cattle. The 2-bedroom house, painted white but now weathered to a soft grey, sat like a monument to memories. Sarah's garden tools still hung in the shed, rusted but carefully preserved, waiting for hands that would never again coax tomatoes and sunflowers from the hard Texas soil. At 62, Elias moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned to husband his strength. His back carried the accumulated aches of 4 decades working cattle and horses, and his bank account reflected the struggles of a small rancher in an era of corporate agriculture. Most mornings, he wondered if he should sell the place and move to town, find a small apartment where the silence wouldn't feel so overwhelming. But something about Willow had spoken to him at the auction. Maybe it was the way she held herself apart from the other horses, or the resigned sadness in her dark eyes. When Buck Morrison had declared her barren and worthless, Elias had felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. He'd seen that same look of defeat in his own mirror on the worst nights after Sarah's passing. The town of Dry Creek sprawled along a creek that ran dry more often than not, its main street lined with businesses that had weathered the boom and bust cycles of cattle country for over a century. The weekly livestock auction drew ranchers from 3 counties, men with hard eyes and harder hands who measured worth in dollars per pound. They'd looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and amusement when he'd bid on the barren mare, muttering about old fools and their soft hearts. Buck Morrison had been the loudest voice in that chorus. A man who owned more land than most small towns, Morrison measured success by the size of his herds and the fear in his workers' eyes. His Broken M ranch stretched across 20,000 acres, and his reputation for ruthless business practices was matched only by his cruelty to animals he deemed unprofitable. When Morrison's men had loaded Willow into Elias's trailer, they'd done so with the rough indifference of men handling cargo rather than a living creature. Now, leading Willow toward the barn, Elias found himself talking to her in the gentle tones he'd once reserved for Sarah. The mare's ears twitched at his voice, and she seemed to relax slightly as they walked. The barn, built by his grandfather in 1943, stood solid and weathered, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Inside, fresh straw covered the floor of a roomy stall, and a trough of clean water waited beside a manger filled with sweet hay. "Easy now, girl," Elias murmured as he led her inside. "This is home now. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Willow entered the stall with hesitant steps, then moved immediately to the water. As she drank, Elias noticed the prominence of her ribs and the dull condition of her coat. Whatever had happened to her before the auction, she hadn't been receiving proper care. His jaw tightened at the thought of deliberate neglect. The ranch reflected Elias's careful stewardship despite his limited resources. The fences, though patched and repatched, stood straight and secure. The water tanks were clean, the feed stored properly, and every piece of equipment maintained with the dedication of a man who couldn't afford replacements. Sarah had once joked that he treated their animals better than he treated himself, and looking back, Elias realized she'd been right. His military service in Vietnam had taught him the value of discipline and attention to detail, lessons that served him well in ranching. 26 months in the jungle had also taught him about the weight of responsibility for those under his care, whether they were soldiers in his unit or animals on his ranch. The bronze star in his dresser drawer collected dust, but the principles it represented still guided his daily actions. As evening settled over the valley, Elias prepared Willow's first meal on the ranch. He mixed oats with molasses and a vitamin supplement, creating a mixture that would help restore her condition. The mare ate eagerly, and for the first time since the auction, she seemed to truly relax. Standing in the barn doorway, watching Willow eat, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. The familiar weight of grief was still there, but alongside it was something he'd almost forgotten: purpose. This mare needed him, and perhaps he needed her just as much. The night air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Stars emerged one by one in the clear sky, the same stars he'd watched with Sarah from their front porch on countless evenings. But tonight, instead of feeling alone beneath their distant light, Elias felt the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. Inside the barn, Willow had finished eating and stood quietly in her stall. When Elias approached, she didn't shy away. Instead, she allowed him to run his hands gently along her neck, feeling the tension begin to leave her muscles. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice carrying across the quiet barn. "Whatever happened before, it's behind you. This is where you belong." As he walked back to the house, Elias found himself looking forward to the morning for the first time in months. Tomorrow, he would begin the patient work of helping Willow recover her strength and trust. It was work he understood, work that had meaning beyond profit and loss. The wedding ring on his finger caught the porch light as he opened the front door. For the first time since Sarah's death, he didn't feel the sharp stab of loss that usually accompanied that glint of gold. Instead, he felt gratitude for the love it represented and hope that love might take new forms. Behind him, the barn stood quiet in the darkness, sheltering a paint mare who had found sanctuary at last. The first light of dawn was just touching the eastern hills when Elias heard them. Soft, nickering sounds carried on the morning breeze, accompanied by the gentle thud of small hooves on packed earth. He'd been up early, as was his habit, preparing Willow's morning feed when the unfamiliar sounds drew him outside. 2 young horses stood at the edge of his property, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the grey light. They were small, no more than yearlings, and even from a distance, Elias could see they were in poor condition. Their heads hung low with exhaustion, and their ribs showed clearly through dull, matted coats. Willow heard them too. Inside the barn, she began calling out, a sound unlike any Elias had heard from her before. It wasn't the casual greeting one horse might give another. It was urgent, desperate, filled with an emotion that made his chest tighten. The foals responded immediately, lifting their heads and calling back. Their voices were weak, but filled with recognition. They began moving toward the barn with shuffling steps, stopping frequently to rest, but never wavering in their direction. Elias stood frozen, understanding flooding through him like cold water. These weren't random horses drawn by the scent of feed. These were Willow's foals, the ones she'd been separated from, the ones that proved Buck Morrison's claim about her being barren was a lie. Moving slowly to avoid startling them, Elias opened the barn door wider. Willow pushed against her stall gate, whinnying frantically as her babies approached. The foals entered the barn on unsteady legs, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. When Elias opened the stall gate, the reunion nearly brought him to his knees. Willow rushed to her foals, nuzzling them frantically, running her muzzle over every inch of their small bodies, as if assuring herself they were real. The foals pressed close to their mother, their exhausted bodies trembling with relief and emotion. For several minutes, Elias simply watched, his throat thick with unshed tears. The raw love and relief in the animal's behavior touched something deep in his soul. He thought of Sarah, of the children they'd never been able to have, of the empty rooms in their house that had echoed with unspoken dreams. The foals were in terrible condition. Their coats were rough and dull, their eyes sunken with dehydration. Dried mud caked their legs, and their hooves showed signs of traveling over rough ground for many miles. One, a dark bay with white markings similar to its mother's, favored its left front leg. The other, a smaller chestnut with a white blaze, bore fresh scratches along its flanks. Elias moved carefully around the reunited family, assessing their needs. Water first, then food, designed for young horses. He filled another trough and brought out the grain mixture he used for growing animals, adding extra supplements to help restore their condition. As the foals drank and ate, Willow remained close, touching them frequently with her muzzle. Her entire demeanor had transformed from the resigned sadness of yesterday to fierce maternal protectiveness. When Elias approached too quickly, she positioned herself between him and her babies, not threatening but clearly ready to defend them. "Easy, Mama," he said softly. "I'm here to help." The pieces of the story were falling into place in Elias's mind, painting a picture that made his anger burn cold and steady. Buck Morrison hadn't just sold a barren mare, he deliberately separated a mother from her foals. The question was why, and where the babies had been all this time. Looking at their condition, Elias guessed they'd been abandoned somewhere, left to fend for themselves while their mother was hauled off to auction. Somehow, they'd survived and followed her scent across miles of harsh country to find her. The determination and love that must have driven them humbled him. As the morning wore on, Elias found himself reluctant to leave the barn. He brought his coffee outside and sat on a hay bale, watching the family settle into their new routine. The foals stayed close to their mother, nursing frequently and resting in the warm straw. Willow remained alert, her ears constantly moving as she monitored their surroundings for threats. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling into his driveway. Through the barn door, Elias could see Buck Morrison's black pickup, its chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The rancher climbed out slowly, his pale eyes scanning the property with calculating interest. Morrison was a big man gone soft around the middle, his expensive hat and boots a sharp contrast to his cruel eyes. He'd inherited his ranch from his father and expanded it through methods that often skirted the edge of legality. His workers feared him, his neighbors avoided him, and his reputation for ruthless business practices was legendary in 3 counties. "Morning, Boone," Morrison called out as he approached the barn. "Heard you bought that worthless mare yesterday. Hope you didn't pay too much for dog food." Elias stood slowly, positioning himself between Morrison and the stall. "She's settling in fine, Buck. What brings you out here so early?" Morrison's eyes fixed on something behind Elias, and his expression changed. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like you've got more horses than you had yesterday. Found them on my property this morning," Elias said carefully. "Strays, by the look of them." "Strays, my ass." Morrison pushed past Elias and stared into the stall. His face darkened as he took in the scene, Willow nursing one of the foals, while the other rested nearby. "Those are mine. That mare was supposed to be barren. Apparently, she wasn't." Morrison's hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand, old man. I've got bills of sale, registration papers, the works. That mare and anything that comes from her belongs to me." Elias felt his military training kick in, the calm alertness that had kept him alive in the jungle. I bought the mare fair and square. These foals were on my property. Far as I know, that makes them mine. We'll see about that. Morrison's voice carried a threat that made Willow pin her ears back. I'll be back with the proper paperwork, and when I am, you better have my property ready to load. After Morrison left, Elias stood in the barn doorway for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. The peaceful morning had been shattered, replaced by a tension that set his teeth on edge. He'd seen men like Morrison before, bullies, who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. But as he looked at Willow and her foals, at the trust beginning to show in their eyes, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, burning bright and clear as a star. These animals had found their way to him for a reason. They'd crossed miles of difficult country, following love and instinct, to be together again. He wasn't about to let Buck Morrison tear them apart. The hoof prints in the dirt outside his barn told a story of determination and hope that touched Elias more deeply than any words could have. Two young animals, alone and frightened, had followed their mother's scent across the harsh Texas landscape. They'd found their way home to each other, and now they'd found safety with him. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, Elias was going to make sure they stayed together. The veterinary journal lay open on the kitchen table, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Elias ran his finger down the pages, searching for guidance his father had recorded 40 years earlier in careful handwriting. The sections on foal care were heavily annotated, filled with practical wisdom earned through experience. Young horses need extra protein and fat to grow proper. His father's notes reminded him, watch for signs of worms, especially in animals that'd been neglected. Fresh water always, and shelter from wind and rain. Elias had inherited more than just the ranch from his father. He'd inherited a philosophy about caring for animals that put their welfare above profit. The old journal, bound in cracked leather and held together with rubber bands, contained decades of observations about horse behavior, treatments for common ailments, and hard-won knowledge about nurturing life in difficult circumstances. The foals were responding well to his care, but their recovery would take time. The smaller one, whom he'd started calling Scout for its habit of exploring every corner of the stall, had gained strength quickly. The larger foal, more cautious and reserved, reminded Elias of himself. He'd named this one Ranger, after the quiet determination it showed in everything it did. Willow watched Elias's every move when he worked around her babies, ready to intervene if she sensed any threat. But gradually, she began to relax, allowing him to touch the foals and check their condition. Her trust was a gift he didn't take lightly. The morning routine had become a meditation for Elias. He would rise before dawn, prepare the feeds with careful attention to each animal's needs, and spend the first hours of daylight in the barn. The simple acts of measuring grain, checking water, and observing his animals gave him a sense of purpose he'd lost after Sarah's death. As he worked, memories of his father flooded back. James Boone had been a man of few words but deep wisdom about horses. He'd taught Elias that every animal had its own personality, its own needs, and its own way of showing trust. Listen with your eyes, he used to say. Horses tell you everything if you pay attention. The advice served Elias well now. Scout was the bold one, quick to approach and eager for attention. Ranger was more thoughtful, watching before acting, but once he decided to trust, his loyalty was complete. Willow remained the guardian, protective but increasingly willing to share her babies with the man who'd given them sanctuary. On the third morning after the foal's arrival, Dr. Martinez drove up in his battered pickup truck. The veterinarian was a small, dark man in his 50s with gentle hands and patient eyes. He'd been caring for Elias's animals since the early days of his marriage to Sarah, and his visits were as much social calls as medical consultations. Heard through the grapevine, you've got some new additions, Martinez said, climbing out of his truck with his medical bag. Buck Morrison's been telling everyone in town that you're hiding stolen livestock. Elias felt his jaw tighten. These foals showed up on my property. Their mother was sold to me as Barren. You do the math. Martinez examined each animal with professional thoroughness, checking their teeth, feeling for lumps and injuries, listening to their hearts and lungs. The foals submitted to his handling with only minor fussing, their trust in Elias extending cautiously to his visitor. "They've been through hell," Martinez concluded, washing his hands in a bucket of warm water. "Probably abandoned for weeks, maybe longer. The bigger one has some scarring on his legs from wire cuts, likely from trying to get through fences. The little one's in better shape, but both of them are underweight and showing signs of stress. Will they recover fully?" "With proper care, yes. You're doing everything right. Good feed, clean water, a safe environment. Time will do the rest." Martinez packed his equipment slowly, clearly wanting to say more. "Elias, you need to be careful. Buck Morrison is telling anyone who'll listen that these horses belong to him. He's got Sheriff Dutton asking questions about livestock theft." The warning didn't surprise Elias, but it crystallized the danger he faced. Tom Dutton had been sheriff for 15 years, elected and re-elected on Buck Morrison's money. The man wore his badge like a license to serve the interests of the county's most powerful rancher. That afternoon, Elias drove into town to buy supplies. Dry Creek's main street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with businesses that reflected the area's agricultural heritage. The feed store, bank, diner, and hardware store served ranchers from 50 miles in any direction. It was also a place where news traveled fast and opinions formed quickly. At Santos Feed and Supply, Maria Santos greeted him with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with silver threading through her dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a generous nature. Her husband had died in a construction accident 5 years earlier, leaving her to run the business alone. "The usual mix for Willow?" she asked, but her tone suggested she knew about the foals. "Double it," Elias said, "and add some of that high-protein supplement for young horses." Maria rang up his order without comment, but as she loaded the bags into his truck, she spoke quietly. "Buck Morrison was in here this morning, asking if I'd seen you buying feed for more than one horse. I told him I minded my own business." The implied warning was clear. Morrison was gathering information, building a case for reclaiming what he considered his property. Elias thanked Maria and drove home, his mind working through the legal implications of his situation. That evening, as he sat in the barn watching the horse family interact, Elias felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These animals had found sanctuary on his land, but keeping them safe would require more than good intentions. It would require courage, possibly sacrifice, and definitely the kind of strength he wasn't sure he still possessed. The foals were playing now, their natural exuberance returning as their health improved. Scout chased imaginary enemies around the stall, while Ranger watched with what looked suspiciously like amusement. Willow observed it all with the patient tolerance of a mother who'd feared she'd never see her children again. Elias thought about Sarah, about how she'd loved watching the barn cats play with their kittens. She'd always said that animals knew things. Humans forgot how to live in the moment, how to love without conditions, how to find joy in simple things. The veterinary journal lay open beside him, his father's wisdom available whenever he needed guidance. But watching the foals discover their strength and security, Elias realized he was learning lessons that couldn't be written down. Lessons about redemption, about the courage required to protect what matters, and about how love sometimes comes in unexpected forms. As night settled over the ranch, he made a silent promise to the 3 horses in his care. Whatever Buck Morrison had planned, whatever legal or illegal means he might use to reclaim them, Elias would be ready. The boy who'd earned a Bronze Star in the jungles of Vietnam was still there, buried under years of grief and routine, but not forgotten. The horse family had found their way home to each other. Now it was his job to make sure they stayed that way. The branding iron glowed orange-hot in the forge's flames, its metal surface bearing the distinctive broken M mark that Buck Morrison stamped on everything he claimed to own. Morrison lifted the iron with heavy tongs, examining the brand that had marked thousands of cattle, horses, and acres of disputed land over the past 20 years. His ranch headquarters sprawled across 100 acres of prime bottomland. The main house, a monument to wealth, built on the backs of underpaid workers and questionable business practices. The bunkhouse, barns, and equipment sheds reflected Morrison's philosophy, functional but harsh, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Morrison had inherited the broken M from his father, but what he'd built since then was entirely his own creation. Through strategic bankruptcies of smaller neighbors, aggressive water rights claims, and political connections that stretched to the state capital, he'd assembled an empire that dominated 3 counties. His reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his skill at staying just inside the boundaries of the law. The Mare and Foals represented more than just livestock to Morrison. They were a threat to a carefully constructed system of control. For 15 years, he'd been running a profitable side business, acquiring horses from struggling ranchers and distant properties where ownership was difficult to trace. The animals were held for a few months, their brands altered or obscured, then sold at auction as bred on the broken M. Willow had been part of that system until she'd proven troublesome. When she'd foaled, Morrison's men had been instructed to take the babies and dispose of the mare. But ranch hand had botched the job, the mare had been sold instead of shot, and the foals had apparently escaped the fate Morrison had ordered for them. Now Elias Boone was harboring evidence of Morrison's illegal operation, and worse, the old fool seemed determined to keep the animals despite the obvious risks. Morrison's political connections wouldn't protect him if a federal investigation uncovered the scope of his horse theft ring. That afternoon, Morrison drove to the sheriff's office in Dry Creek. The building was small and weathered, a relic from the town's early days as a cattle shipping center. Sheriff Tom Dutton occupied an office that smelled of coffee and old paperwork, his desk covered with forms that rarely got filed properly. Dutton was a thin man with nervous eyes and a politician's smile. He'd held the sheriff's position for 15 years by understanding which way the political winds blew and making sure he stayed on the winning side. His loyalty to Morrison was purely transactional. As long as the campaign contributions kept flowing, Dutton remained Morrison's man in uniform. "Tom, I've got a problem that needs official attention," Morrison said, settling his bulk into the chair across from Dutton's desk. "Elias Boone has stolen livestock on his property, 3 horses that belong to me." Dutton shifted uncomfortably. "Buck, you know I can't just waltz onto a man's property without cause. Boone's got rights, even if he is getting strange in his old age. I bought those horses fair and square, got bills of sale for all of them. Then I discover Boone's hiding them on his ranch, claiming they just wandered onto his property." Morrison's voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. The sheriff made notes with exaggerated care, buying time to think. A direct confrontation with Elias Boone would attract attention, possibly from state authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about other aspects of Morrison's business dealings. "Tell you what," Dutton said finally, "let me do some investigating, talk to a few people, see what the legal situation really is. We want to make sure we do this by the book." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on the sheriff with predatory intensity. "Tom, those horses are worth significant money. Every day they're on Boone's property is costing me. I'd hate to think my sheriff wasn't protecting my property rights." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dutton nodded quickly, understanding perfectly. "I'll have some answers for you by tomorrow, Buck. Count on it." Meanwhile, Elias was discovering that caring for the horse family was awakening parts of himself he'd thought were gone forever. Each morning brought small victories, Scouts' increasing boldness, Rangers' growing trust, Willow's gradual relaxation in their presence. The work was demanding but rewarding in ways that his routine cattle operations had never been. The foals were gaining weight and strength daily. Their coats were beginning to shine with proper nutrition, and their eyes had lost the hollow look of animals who'd given up hope. They played together in the small paddock Elias had prepared for them, their antics bringing the first genuine laughter he'd experienced in years. But the shadow of Buck Morrison's threat hung over everything. Elias had consulted with Jake Brennan, the only lawyer in Dry Creek, and the legal situation was murky at best. Texas law regarding stray livestock was complex, and Morrison's claimed ownership of Willow complicated everything. Brennan, a serious man in his 40s with graying temples and careful eyes, had been blunt about Elias's chances. If Morrison has legitimate ownership documents for the mare, he's got a strong claim on any offspring. The fact that the foals were found on your property helps, but it's not definitive. That evening, as Elias performed his routine barn chores, he found himself remembering conversations with Sarah about the children they'd never had. She'd always said that love wasn't about biology, it was about commitment, about choosing to care for someone vulnerable who needed protection. Looking at the horse family, now resting peacefully in their stall, Elias felt that same protective instinct Sarah had described. These animals hadn't chosen their circumstances, but they'd chosen to trust him. That trust carried obligations he wasn't prepared to ignore. The sound of a truck engine broke his reverie. Through the barn door, he could see headlights approaching fast. The vehicle stopped abruptly in his driveway, and two men climbed out. Even in the poor light, Elias recognized Buck Morrison's bulk and the thinner silhouette of Sheriff Dutton. "Evening, Elias," Morrison called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Sheriff Dutton has some questions about your new livestock." Dutton approached with obvious reluctance, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt. "Elias, I need to ask you about the horses you're keeping here. Mr. Morrison claims they're his property." "I told Morrison yesterday," Elias replied calmly. "The mare was purchased legally at auction. The foals were found on my property." "That's theft, plain and simple," Morrison interrupted. "I've got bills of sale that prove ownership. Sheriff, I want those horses confiscated immediately." Dutton looked uncomfortable with the aggressive stance Morrison was taking. "Elias, would you mind if I took a look at the animals in question, just to document what we're dealing with here?" Inside the barn, Willow sensed the tension and positioned herself protectively in front of her foals. The animals' obvious fear of Morrison was telling they recognized him as a threat, their instincts warning them about the man who'd ordered their separation and abandonment. "These are my horses," Morrison declared, staring at the family with cold satisfaction. "I want them loaded and returned to my property tonight." But as he spoke, Scout moved closer to Elias, seeking protection from the familiar voice that meant danger. The foal's action was subtle but unmistakable. He was choosing his protector, demonstrating a trust that couldn't be faked or forced. Elias felt something crystallize inside him, a determination as solid and unshakable as bedrock. These animals had suffered enough. They'd found safety and love on his ranch, and he wasn't going to let them be dragged back into the hell they'd escaped. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "these animals are staying right here until this matter is resolved legally. If Morrison wants them, he can prove ownership in court." Morrison's face darkened with rage, but Dutton stepped between the two men before the confrontation could escalate. "That sounds reasonable, Buck. Let's let the lawyers sort this out properly." As the two men left, Morrison's parting words carried a promise of future violence. "This isn't over, old man. Those are my horses, and I always collect what's owed to me." Alone with the horses again, Elias felt the weight of the challenge ahead. Morrison wasn't going to be satisfied with legal proceedings. Men like him took what they wanted through intimidation and force. The confrontation had revealed the true stakes of the situation, and Elias understood that protecting his new family might require everything he had to give. But as he watched Scout and Ranger settle down for the night, safe and secure beside their mother, he knew the choice had already been made. Some battles chose you, and this was one of them. Sarah's garden tools hung exactly where she'd left them 3 years ago, their handles smooth from decades of use, their metal surfaces now touched with rust that Elias had never quite brought himself to clean away. The small hand spade, the pruning shears, the cultivator with its bent tines, each tool held memories of quiet mornings when Sarah had coaxed life from the hard Texas soil. Now, As Elias reached for the spade to clear weeds from the fence line where the horses grazed, he felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using her tools to create a safer space for the animals that were helping him heal from her loss. "What do you think, Sarah?" he said softly to the morning air. "These horses need me, but I think maybe I need them more." The foals had transformed in the week since their arrival. Scout had grown bold enough to approach the fence when visitors came by, while Ranger remained more cautious but no longer fled at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Both had gained weight and muscle, their coats beginning to show the lustrous health that proper care provided. Willow watched everything with the vigilant protectiveness of a mother who had learned not to take safety for granted. But even she was beginning to relax, allowing herself moments of contentment as she grazed while her foals played nearby. The trust she was placing in Elias felt like a sacred responsibility. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias found himself looking forward to each day. The routine of caring for the horses gave structure to his mornings, and their progress filled him with a satisfaction he'd almost forgotten was possible. When Scout nuzzled his hand seeking attention, or when Ranger finally allowed himself to be petted, Elias felt echoes of the joy he'd shared with Sarah when they'd watched new calves take their first steps. But the peaceful routine was constantly shadowed by the threat of Buck Morrison's return. Twice in the past week, Morrison's men had driven slowly past the ranch, their attention focused on the pasture where the horses grazed. The message was clear: they were being watched, evaluated, and plans were being made. Dr. Martinez had stopped by again, ostensibly to check on the foal's progress, but really to warn Elias about the rumors circulating in town. Morrison was telling anyone who would listen that Elias was harboring stolen livestock, and some people were beginning to believe the accusations. "You need to understand what you're up against," Martinez had said, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by serious concern. "Buck Morrison doesn't just own the biggest ranch in 3 counties. He owns people. Sheriff Dutton, half the county commissioners, probably the judge too. If this goes to court, you're fighting the whole system." The warning had been sobering, but it hadn't changed Elias's determination. He'd seen too much corruption in his military service to be intimidated by it now. Sometimes doing what was right meant standing against a system that had forgotten what justice looked like. That afternoon, as Elias worked on reinforcing the fence around the horse pasture, he made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a corner post, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into a hollow space, he found a small leather pouch. Inside were documents, veterinary records, registration papers, and a bill of sale that told a story very different from Buck Morrison's version of events. According to the papers, Willow had originally belonged to the Clearwater Ranch, a family operation about 60 miles east of Dry Creek. The registration showed her breeding bloodline, valuable enough to make her worth significant money as a broodmare. The veterinary records documented 2 successful pregnancies, proving definitively that she had never been barren. The final document was the most damning, a bill of sale dated just 6 months ago, showing that Morrison had purchased Willow from someone named Jake Clearwater for $300, well below her actual value. The circumstances suggested either coercion or desperation on the seller's part. Elias studied the papers carefully, understanding their significance. They proved that Morrison had lied about Willow's breeding history and suggested that the original sale might not have been legitimate. More importantly, they raised questions about how many other horses Morrison had acquired through similar questionable transactions. As evening approached, Elias sat in the barn with the horse family, watching the foals nurse while their mother dozed peacefully. The documents were spread on a hay bale beside him, evidence of a truth that Buck Morrison had tried to bury. The discovery filled Elias with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The papers might provide legal ammunition to fight Morrison's claims, but they also revealed the scope of what he was really up against. This wasn't just about one mare and her foals. It was about a criminal enterprise that Morrison would do anything to protect. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias felt the familiar sensation of purpose that had once driven him through dangerous missions in Vietnam. The stakes were different now, but the principle was the same: protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing up to bullies who used power to crush the innocent. He thought about Sarah's hands working in her garden, nurturing seedlings that would grow into flowers and vegetables that fed both body and soul. She'd understood that some things were worth the effort they required, that growth demanded patience and protection from those who would destroy it. Looking at Scout and Ranger, now strong enough to play and explore with the confidence of young animals who felt secure, Elias saw the fruits of that same patient nurturing. These horses were more than livestock to him now; they were family, and family was worth fighting for. The garden tools in his hands felt familiar and right, instruments of growth and protection that connected him to Sarah's memory and his own renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight his family was safe, healthy, and together. As darkness settled over the ranch, Elias made his plans. The hidden documents would go to Jake Brennan first thing in the morning, along with a request to investigate the Clearwater Ranch sale. But legal action alone wouldn't be enough. Morrison had too much influence over the local system. What Elias needed was a way to expose Morrison's entire operation, to bring enough outside attention to the situation that local corruption couldn't protect the man. The horse theft ring had probably been operating for years, victimizing small ranchers who couldn't fight back. But Elias wasn't helpless, and he wasn't alone. Dr. Martinez had proven himself a friend, and Maria Santos had shown she was willing to stand up to Morrison's intimidation. Perhaps there were others in the community who were tired of living under the thumb of a man who thought his wealth gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. The battle for his horse family was about to become something much larger, a fight for the soul of a community that had forgotten what it meant to stand up for what was right. The property deed lay spread across Jake Brennan's desk, its legal language and official seals representing more than just ownership. They represented the foundation of everything Elias had built with Sarah, and now everything he was fighting to protect. The yellow document, signed 35 years ago, when he and Sarah had first bought the ranch, felt like a shield against the storm gathering around them. Brennan studied the hidden documents Elias had discovered, his expression growing more serious with each page. The lawyer was a methodical man who'd built his practice on careful attention to detail, and what he was seeing painted a picture of systematic fraud that reached far beyond one stolen mare. "These change everything," Brennan said finally, setting down the last page. "If we can prove that Morrison obtained Willow through fraudulent means, his ownership claim becomes worthless. But Elias, you need to understand what we're really dealing with here." The Clearwater Ranch records showed a pattern that made Elias's blood run cold. Jake Clearwater had sold not just Willow, but a dozen other horses to Morrison over the past 2 years, all at prices well below market value. The sales had occurred during a period when Clearwater was fighting a losing battle against drought and falling cattle prices. Morrison targeted a desperate man, Brennan explained. Probably offered just enough cash to keep the bank from foreclosing, then took the best breeding stock at fire sale prices. It's legal, technically, but it's predatory as hell. The lawyer's investigation had revealed that Jake Clearwater had died just 3 months after the last sale to Morrison, leaving behind a daughter who'd lost the family ranch to bankruptcy. The timing suggested that Morrison had known exactly how desperate Clearwater was and had used that desperation to acquire valuable horses for almost nothing. But Morrison's threats were escalating beyond legal maneuvering. That morning, Elias had found his fence cut in 2 places, and several of his cattle had wandered onto the county road. No real damage had been done, but the message was clear. Morrison's patience was wearing thin. Sheriff Dutton had responded to Elias's complaint about the vandalism with obvious reluctance, making notes he clearly had no intention of acting upon. The investigation consisted of a few perfunctory questions and a suggestion that Elias should consider working things out privately with Morrison. "Tom, someone cut my fence with bolt cutters," Elias had pointed out. That's destruction of property, maybe attempted theft. Hard to prove who did it, Dutton had replied, not meeting Elias's eyes. Could have been anyone. Teenagers, maybe. You know how kids are these days. The encounter had confirmed what Elias already suspected: the local law enforcement system was completely compromised. Morrison's influence extended through every level of county government, making a fair legal resolution nearly impossible. That afternoon, Dr. Martinez arrived with news that added another layer of complexity to the situation. During his examination of Willow, he'd made a discovery that changed the stakes of the entire conflict. "She's pregnant again," Martinez announced, his voice mixing excitement with concern. "About 3 months along, I'd estimate. The foal should arrive in late spring." The news hit Elias like a physical blow. Another foal meant another life to protect, another reason for Morrison to escalate his efforts to reclaim what he considered his property. But it also meant hope-proof that Willow was thriving under his care, that the family he'd rescued was continuing to grow. Willow seemed to sense the importance of the moment. She nuzzled Elias's shoulder gently, her dark eyes reflecting a trust that humbled him. She was placing not just her life, but the life of her unborn foal in his hands. That evening, as Elias sat on his front porch watching the horses graze in the pasture, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The property deed in his pocket represented his right to be here, to make decisions about what happened on his land. But rights were meaningless without the strength to defend them. Maria Santos arrived just as the sun was setting, her pickup truck kicking up dust as she parked beside his porch. She climbed out, carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression that mixed determination with concern. "Heard about your fence being cut," she said without preamble. "Figured you might not have had time to cook today." The casserole was still warm, filled with the kind of comfort food that spoke of genuine caring. As they sat on the porch, sharing the meal, Maria revealed that she'd been dealing with her own pressure from Morrison. "He came by the feed store yesterday, asking about your purchases again. When I told him I don't discuss customers' business, he suggested I might find it hard to get deliveries if I kept being uncooperative." The threat was typical Morrison economic pressure, applied through his network of business relationships. Most people in the county depended on Morrison's goodwill for their livelihoods, making resistance to his demands nearly impossible. "You don't have to get involved in this, Maria," Elias said. "Morrison's fight is with me." "That's where you're wrong," she replied firmly. "Buck Morrison has been running roughshod over this county for 20 years. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that decent people won't be intimidated forever." As they talked, Elias found himself studying Maria's face in the fading light. She was a handsome woman with strong features and intelligent eyes, someone who'd built a successful business through hard work and integrity. Her willingness to stand with him despite the risks touched something in his heart that had been closed since Sarah's death. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. 3 pickup trucks turned into Elias's driveway, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Morrison climbed out of the lead truck, followed by 6 of his ranch hands, hard men with dangerous eyes who'd been hired as much for their willingness to use violence as their skill with cattle. "Evening, folks," Morrison called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Elias stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept just inside the front door. Beside him, Maria rose as well, her chin lifted in defiance despite the obvious danger. "What do you want, Buck?" Elias asked. Morrison's pale eyes fixed on the pasture where the horses grazed, then returned to Elias with predatory intensity. "I want what's mine. Those horses have been on your property for 2 weeks now. That's 2 weeks of feed, care, and breeding fees you owe me. Those horses aren't going anywhere until a court says otherwise." "Courts can be slow," Morrison replied, signaling his men to spread out around the porch. "Sometimes a man has to take matters into his own hands to protect his property." The threat was unmistakable now. Morrison had abandoned any pretense of legal process and was preparing to take the horses by force. His men were positioning themselves strategically, cutting off escape routes and creating intimidation through superior numbers. But as Elias looked at the faces surrounding him, he saw something that gave him hope. These weren't soldiers or trained fighters. They were ranch hands and drifters, hired for their willingness to follow orders. They might be dangerous in a mob, but they lacked the discipline and training that had kept him alive in Vietnam. More importantly, he wasn't alone. Maria stood beside him, her presence a reminder that good people would stand up when the moment demanded courage. Somewhere in town, Dr. Martinez was probably preparing to come to their aid if needed. Even Jake Brennan, despite his concerns about the legal system, was working to find a way to expose Morrison's crimes. The property deed in Elias's pocket felt warm against his chest, a tangible reminder of his right to be here, to protect what he'd built. This was his land, his home, his family now, and some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "You've got 5 minutes to load those horses and get them off my property," Morrison continued, his voice hardening. "After that, we're coming to get them ourselves." Elias felt the familiar calm that had always preceded action in combat situations. Time seemed to slow as he evaluated threats, calculated odds, and prepared for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. "Those horses stay where they are," he said quietly. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." The hidden brand on Willow's shoulder was barely visible beneath her thick winter coat, but Maria's sharp eyes caught the faded mark as she helped Elias examine the mare in the barn's lamplight. Morrison and his men had retreated after their failed intimidation attempt, but the discovery Maria made changed everything about the situation they thought they understood. "Hold the light closer," Maria whispered, her fingers tracing the faded outline beneath Willow's hair. "This isn't the Broken M brand." Elias leaned in, squinting at the mark that had been deliberately obscured. As Maria carefully parted the hair, revealing the underlying scar tissue, a different brand emerged, 2 interlocked circles over a bar, the registered mark of the Clearwater Ranch. She was rebranded. Elias breathed, understanding flooding through him. Morrison didn't buy her from Clearwater, he stole her and changed her brand to cover the theft. The implications hit them both simultaneously. If Willow had been stolen from the Clearwater Ranch, then Morrison's entire ownership claim was built on criminal fraud. More than that, it suggested a systematic operation that had been stealing and rebranding horses across multiple counties for years. Maria pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the hidden brand, documenting the evidence from multiple angles. "We need to call Jake Brennan immediately. This proves Morrison committed a felony." But as Elias studied the faded mark, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The careful way the brand had been altered, the professional appearance of the modification, this wasn't the work of amateurs. Morrison had been running a sophisticated horse theft operation, complete with the tools and expertise needed to alter brands convincingly. "There's more," Elias said grimly. "If Morrison was stealing horses and altering their brands, how many other purchases in his records are actually thefts? How many families lost their animals to his operation?" The scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise was staggering. For years, he'd been targeting vulnerable ranchers, stealing their best breeding stock and selling the animals at auction with fraudulent documentation. The profits had funded his political influence and expanded his legitimate ranching operations, creating a criminal empire hidden behind a facade of respectability. Dr. Martinez arrived within an hour of their phone call, bringing with him equipment that could photograph the brand in detail and equipment to examine Willow for any other signs of abuse or alteration. What he found painted an even darker picture of Morrison's methods. "These scars on her legs," Martinez pointed out, indicating healed wounds near Willow's fetlocks. "They're from hobbles, restraints used to prevent horses from running. Someone kept her chained for weeks, maybe months." The evidence suggested that Morrison's operation included a holding facility where stolen horses were kept while their brands were altered and their identities obscured. The animals would have been held in brutal conditions, restrained and abused until their appearance could be sufficiently changed to prevent recognition. Willow's story was becoming clear now. She'd been stolen from the Clearwater Ranch, probably during one of Morrison's business visits to the desperate owner. She'd been held at the hidden facility, rebranded, and kept chained until she could be introduced into Morrison's legitimate herd. When she'd foaled, the babies had been seen as problems to be eliminated, while she was sold as Barren to avoid future complications. But Willow's foals had proven more resourceful than Morrison's men had anticipated. They'd escaped whatever fate had been planned for them and followed their mother's trail across miles of harsh country, reuniting the family that Morrison had tried to destroy. Jake Brennan arrived at the ranch near midnight, his usual professional composure replaced by excitement as he examined the evidence. The hidden brand, combined with the fraudulent documentation, provided grounds for criminal charges that could bring down Morrison's entire operation. "This is federal horse theft," Brennan explained. "Interstate transportation of stolen livestock carries serious penalties. But we need more evidence proof of the systematic nature of Morrison's operation, documentation of other thefts, evidence of the holding facility." The lawyer's excitement was tempered by reality. Exposing Morrison's crimes would require investigation by federal authorities, but getting their attention would mean convincing them that local law enforcement was compromised. It was a delicate balance. Moving too quickly might allow Morrison to destroy evidence, but waiting too long could result in more thefts or retaliation against Elias. As dawn approached, the group formulated a plan that would expose Morrison's operation while protecting the evidence they'd discovered. Maria would contact a friend who worked for the state attorney general's office, someone outside Morrison's sphere of influence who could initiate a proper investigation. Dr. Martinez would reach out to veterinary colleagues who might have treated other horses with suspicious brand alterations. Brennan would research property records to identify possible locations for Morrison's holding facility. But Elias had a different role to play. As the only person who directly confronted Morrison and survived his intimidation attempts, he would serve as the focal point for drawing out the man's desperation. Morrison would undoubtedly escalate his efforts to reclaim Willow and her foals, especially once he realized that his secret was being uncovered. "You're putting yourself in serious danger," Martinez warned. "Morrison has killed to protect his operation before Jake Clearwater's death might not have been natural." The possibility that Morrison had murdered Jake Clearwater to silence him added another layer of urgency to their mission. If the rancher was willing to commit murder to protect his criminal enterprise, then Elias and anyone helping him were potential targets. But looking at Willow and her foals, now resting peacefully in their stall, Elias felt the same determination that had carried him through combat in Vietnam. These animals had survived theft, abuse, separation, and abandonment to find safety on his ranch. They deserved better than to be treated as commodities in Morrison's criminal enterprise. The hidden brand on Willow's shoulder represented more than just evidence of a crime. It was proof of her true identity, her real heritage, and her right to the life Morrison had tried to steal from her. Just as Elias's property deed represented his right to the land he'd built his life on, the Clearwater brand represented Willow's connection to the family that had truly loved her. As the sun rose over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle ahead would be dangerous, but it was about more than just saving 3 horses. It was about exposing a criminal enterprise that had victimized countless families, bringing justice to a community that had lived under Morrison's thumb for too long. The truth about Willow's stolen identity had changed everything. Now, it was time to make sure that truth saw the light of day, no matter what Buck Morrison did to stop them. Standing in the barn doorway, watching his horse family graze peacefully in the morning light, Elias made a silent promise. Willow would never wear chains again, her foals would grow up free and safe, and Buck Morrison's reign of terror would finally come to an end. The hidden brand had revealed Morrison's greatest secret. Now that secret would become his downfall. The bronze star lay heavy in Elias's weathered hands, its ribbon faded, but the metal still bright after all these years. He'd kept it buried in his dresser drawer since Sarah's funeral, unable to bear the memories it carried of a young soldier who'd believed courage could change the world. Now, as he pinned it inside his shirt pocket, those memories felt like armor against the battle ahead. The medal had been earned in a jungle clearing outside Da Nang, where Sergeant Elias Boone had held a position against overwhelming odds while wounded comrades were evacuated. He'd been 23 then, strong and certain, fighting for brothers he'd never see again. Now he was 62, fighting for a different kind of family, but the stakes felt just as high. State investigators had arrived in Dry Creek that morning, their unmarked cars drawing curious stares as they set up operations in the abandoned insurance office across from the diner. Maria's contact in the Attorney General's office had moved quickly once they'd provided the evidence of Morrison's horse theft operation, but federal bureaucracy still moved slowly when lives were at stake. Dr. Martinez had made a crucial discovery during his investigation of veterinary records across 3 counties. At least 15 horses had been treated for brand alterations in the past 5 years, all of them traced back to sales from Morrison's ranch. The pattern was unmistakable. Morrison had been stealing horses, altering their brands, and selling them through legitimate channels for enormous profits. Jake Brennan's research had been equally damning. Property records showed that Morrison owned several remote parcels that weren't listed as part of his main ranching operations. Satellite imagery of these locations revealed structures that could serve as holding facilities for stolen livestock, complete with heavy-duty fencing and loading chutes designed for secrecy rather than efficiency. But Morrison wasn't waiting for the legal system to close in on him. His response to the investigation had been swift and vicious. 2 of the state investigators' vehicles had been vandalized overnight, their tires slashed and windows broken. Sheriff Dutton had dutifully filed a report and promised to investigate, but his efforts were transparently half-hearted. More troubling, several people who'd spoken to investigators had received threatening phone calls warning them to mind their own business. Maria's feed store had been broken into, though nothing had been stolen, a clear message that Morrison knew who was helping the investigation. The morning brought news that escalated the crisis to a breaking point. Dr. Martinez arrived at Elias's ranch with a grim expression and information that changed everything. They found Jake Clearwater's daughter, Martinez announced. She's been trying to track down her father's stolen horses for months. When she heard about Willow, she drove down from Oklahoma to see for herself. Elizabeth Clearwater was a woman in her 30s, with her father's gentle eyes and her own steel determination. She'd lost the family ranch to bankruptcy after her father's death, but she'd never stopped believing that his horses had been stolen rather than legitimately sold. Seeing Willow confirmed her worst fears and gave her hope at the same time. "That's my father's mare," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion as she stood at the pasture fence. "I raised her from a foal, trained her myself. Dad would never have sold her willingly, especially not to Buck Morrison." Elizabeth's testimony provided the final piece of evidence the investigators needed to prove Morrison's criminal enterprise. She could identify not just Willow, but several other horses that had disappeared from the Clearwater Ranch in the months before her father's death. Her father's veterinary records matched Martinez's findings about brand alterations, and her knowledge of the horses' bloodlines proved their true value. But Morrison's desperation was reaching dangerous levels. Word had spread through the county that federal investigators were building a case against him, and his response had been to accelerate his plans rather than retreat. If he was going down, he seemed determined to eliminate the evidence that could convict him. That afternoon, Elias received a phone call that made his blood run cold. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear. "You have until sunset to load those horses and drive them to the abandoned grain elevator on County Road 47. Come alone, or we start burning down buildings in town." Nay, the threat wasn't just against Elias. Morrison was prepared to hurt innocent people to get what he wanted. The abandoned grain elevator was perfect for an ambush, isolated and surrounded by empty fields where gunshots wouldn't be heard. Morrison was done with legal maneuvering and intimidation. This was going to be settled with violence. Elias called Jake Brennan immediately, but the lawyer's response was frustrating. The state investigators won't authorize a raid based on an anonymous threat. They need more time to build their case properly. Time we don't have. Elias replied grimly, Morrison's not going to wait for warrants and proper procedures. He's planning to take the horses tonight, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. Dr. Martinez and Maria arrived at the ranch within an hour, both determined to help despite the obvious danger. Elizabeth Clearwater came with them, her presence adding both moral authority and additional risk to the situation. This isn't your fight, Elias told them. Morrison's quarrel is with me. You're wrong, Maria replied firmly. This is about whether decent people will stand up to a bully or whether we'll let him destroy everything good in this community. I'm not running away. As evening approached, Elias found himself making preparations that felt disturbingly familiar. He checked his rifle and loaded extra ammunition, planned sightlines and fallback positions, and mentally rehearsed the tactics that had kept him alive in Vietnam. The bronze star pressed against his chest, a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting in spite of fear when something important was at stake. Willow seemed to sense the tension in the air. She kept her foals close, her head raised and ears forward as she scanned for threats. The pregnancy that Dr. Martinez had discovered added another layer of vulnerability. Stress could harm both her and the unborn foal. The plan Elias formulated was simple but dangerous. He would appear to comply with Morrison's demands, loading the horses as ordered and driving toward the grain elevator. But instead of delivering them into Morrison's hands, he would use the opportunity to draw the man out into the open, where the state investigators could witness his crimes. It was a desperate gamble that put the horses at risk, but waiting for legal processes to unfold meant accepting Morrison's threats against innocent people in town. Sometimes the right choice was also the most dangerous one. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Elias felt the familiar calm that had always preceded action. The bronze star in his pocket connected him to the young soldier who'd learned that some battles chose you and that running away only delayed the inevitable confrontation. Willow and her foals stood in their stall, trusting him to keep them safe. Elizabeth Clearwater watched from the barn doorway, tears in her eyes as she saw her father's mare preparing for another ordeal. Maria and Dr. Martinez flanked the entrance, their presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. The horse trailer was loaded and ready, the path to the grain elevator mapped out in his mind. In his shirt pocket, alongside the bronze star, was his father's veterinary journal, filled with wisdom about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Tonight would determine whether Buck Morrison's reign of terror continued or whether justice finally came to the hardscrabble county that had suffered under his rule for too long. Either way, Elias was ready for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The horses needed him to be brave one more time. The memory of Sarah's voice, encouraging him to do what was right regardless of the cost, gave him strength as he prepared for the battle ahead. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The barn door latch clicked with the finality of a rifle bolt as Elias secured it one last time, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. He'd reinforced the simple mechanism with steel cable that morning, knowing that protecting what mattered most sometimes came down to the smallest details. The latch represented his determination to safeguard the horses in his care, no matter what Buck Morrison brought to bear against them. The grain elevator loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to abandoned dreams, its concrete walls scarred by decades of weather and neglect. Elias sat in his truck at the base of the structure, the horse trailer behind him empty as planned, while Morrison's vehicles arranged themselves in a semicircle that blocked any escape routes. 6 men climbed out of the trucks, their silhouettes made menacing by the weapons they carried openly. Morrison himself emerged last, his bulk unmistakable even in the fading light. He approached Elias's truck with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Smart choice, old man," Morrison called out. "Where are my horses?" "Safe," Elias replied, climbing out of his truck slowly. "And they're going to stay that way until this situation is resolved legally." Morrison's face darkened with rage. "You've caused me enough trouble. Those horses belong to me, and I'm taking them tonight, whether you cooperate or not." The confrontation Elias had planned was working exactly as he'd hoped. Hidden in the brush around the grain elevator, state investigators were recording everything, building the case that would finally bring Morrison down. But the rancher's desperation was making him more dangerous than Elias had anticipated. "I know what you did to Jake Clearwater," Elias said, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "I know about the horses you've stolen, the brands you've altered, the families you've destroyed. It's over, Buck." The words hit Morrison like physical blows. His pale eyes darted around the scene, suddenly aware that he might have walked into a trap. "You're wearing a wire," he accused. "You brought the feds here." Before Elias could respond, Morrison signaled his men. They spread out quickly, their weapons raised and ready. The situation was escalating beyond anyone's control, turning from a planned sting operation into a potentially deadly confrontation. From his position near the truck, Elias could see movement in the brush where the investigators were hidden. Morrison's paranoia was justified. They were being watched and recorded, but the rancher's violent response was threatening to turn a law enforcement operation into a bloodbath. "Nobody has to get hurt here," Elias said, raising his hands to show he wasn't armed. "Just walk away, Buck. It's over." But Morrison was beyond reason now. Years of unchallenged power had convinced him that violence was always an acceptable solution to his problems. He pulled a pistol from his jacket and pointed it directly at Elias. "You should have minded your own business, old man. Now you're going to tell me exactly where those horses are, or I'm going to start shooting." The threat galvanized the hidden investigators into action. Spotlights blazed to life around the grain elevator, turning night into harsh day and revealing the federal agents who emerged from concealment with weapons drawn. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" The command echoed across the lot, amplified by megaphones and the authority of federal law enforcement. Morrison's men looked around in panic, realizing they were surrounded and outgunned, but their boss was too consumed by rage to surrender. Instead of dropping his weapon, he grabbed Elias and pressed the gun to his head. "Back off, or the old man dies," Morrison shouted. "I want safe passage out of here, and I want those horses delivered to my ranch by morning." The standoff stretched taut as federal agents took positions around the grain elevator. Their leader, a woman with steel-gray hair and 20 years of experience in dangerous situations, approached slowly with her hands visible. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the State Bureau of Investigation. We have evidence of your criminal activities. Let Mr. Boone go, and we can work this out peacefully." "Evidence?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "You think you can prove anything against me? I own this county, lady. Judges, sheriff, county commissioners, they all owe me." But even as he spoke, Morrison's voice carried the desperation of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. The federal investigation had moved beyond local corruption, beyond his ability to influence or control. For the first time in 20 years, Buck Morrison was facing consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. Elias felt the cold metal of Morrison's gun against his temple, but his mind remained calm and focused. The bronze star in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, connecting him to the young soldier who'd learned that sometimes the best way to protect others was to accept personal risk. "Your horses are safe, Buck," Elias said quietly. "But they were never really yours, were they? You stole them from Jake Clearwater, just like you've stolen from dozens of other families." The words hit their target. Morrison's grip tightened on both his hostage and his weapon, but Elias could feel the uncertainty in the man's movements. The criminal was realizing that his secrets were no longer secret, that his crimes were about to be exposed to the world. In the distance, Elias could hear the sound of more vehicles approaching backup units, probably, or maybe the local media drawn by reports of a federal operation. Whatever happened next, it was going to happen in front of witnesses that Morrison couldn't intimidate or corrupt. The barn door latch he'd reinforced that morning felt symbolic now. He'd done everything possible to protect what mattered most. The horses were safe at his ranch, guarded by Maria, Dr. Martinez, and Elizabeth Clearwater. Even if Morrison succeeded in his threats, the evidence of his crimes was already in federal hands. "Time's up, Morrison," Agent Chen called out. "Release Mr. Boone, and we can discuss terms." But Morrison was beyond negotiation. His criminal empire was collapsing around him, and desperation was making him increasingly dangerous. The gun pressed against Elias's head trembled slightly, suggesting that Morrison was fighting an internal battle between surrender and violence. Around the grain elevator, federal agents maintained their positions, while Morrison's men began to realize the hopelessness of their situation. One by one, they started lowering their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. The smart ones understood that following Morrison into a federal shootout was a suicide mission. As his support crumbled around him, Morrison's grip on reality seemed to slip as well. "Those horses belong to me," he muttered. "Everything in this county belongs to me. I built this place. I own these people." But ownership built on fear and corruption was proving to be an illusion. The federal agents surrounding him represented a power greater than local political connections, a justice system that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Elias felt Morrison's hand beginning to shake, the gun wavering against his temple. The moment of maximum danger was approaching the instant when a desperate man, with nothing left to lose, might pull the trigger rather than face the consequences of his crimes. The new foal's first cry pierced the tense night air, just as Morrison's finger began to tighten on the trigger. The sound carried across the empty lot from the direction of Elias's ranch. Faint but unmistakable, the voice of new life, entering a world balanced on the edge of violence. Even Morrison heard it, his head turning slightly toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Elias felt the gun's pressure lessen against his temple. The cry of Willow's newborn baby seemed to remind everyone present that this confrontation was about more than crime and punishment. It was about protecting the innocent and defenseless. "She's foaling," Elias said quietly. "Willow's having her baby right now, while you're pointing a gun at an old man's head. Is this really what you want to be remembered for?" The words hit Morrison with unexpected force. For just an instant, his facade of ruthless determination cracked, revealing the frightened man beneath. He'd built his empire on the premise that might made right, that power justified any action. But the sound of new life being born challenged that philosophy at its foundation. Agent Chen recognized the opening and pressed her advantage. "Mr. Morrison, you have children of your own, grandchildren. What would they think if they saw you now?" Morrison's grip on his weapon wavered as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. His criminal enterprise was exposed, his political protection had evaporated, and he was surrounded by federal agents with overwhelming firepower. More importantly, the community that had feared him for so long was watching his downfall through the news cameras that had arrived to document the confrontation. "Those horses are mine," he said again, but his voice lacked conviction now. The words sounded hollow, the desperate protest of a man whose worldview was collapsing around him. From his ranch, carried on the wind, came another sound, voices celebrating the successful birth. The joy of people who understood that new life was always a miracle worth protecting. Maria's laughter mixed with Dr. Martinez's professional satisfaction and Elizabeth Clearwater's tears of happiness. The horse family that Morrison had tried to destroy was not only surviving but growing. Elias felt Morrison's hand beginning to tremble more violently. The rancher was realizing that everything he'd fought to protect was already lost. His reputation, his political influence, his freedom, all of it was gone, sacrificed in a desperate attempt to maintain control over animals that had never truly belonged to him. "Let me go, Buck," Elias said gently. "It's over. Don't make this worse than it already is." For a long moment, Morrison stood frozen, the gun still pressed against Elias's head, but his resolve crumbling. Around the grain elevator, federal agents maintained their positions while his own men continued to surrender one by one. The empire he'd built through fear and corruption was dissolving in real time. Then, as if the sound of the newborn foal had broken something inside him, Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat. The gun wavered, then dropped to his side as he released his grip on Elias. "I built this county," Morrison said, his voice hollow with defeat. "I made it what it is. You ruled it through fear," Agent Chen replied, moving forward carefully. "That's not the same thing as building it up." As federal agents surrounded Morrison and secured his weapon, Elias felt the weight of tension finally lifting from his shoulders. The confrontation that had threatened to destroy everything he cared about was ending not with violence, but with justice. Morrison submitted to arrest with the stunned compliance of a man whose world had just collapsed. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he seemed to age years in seconds, the weight of his crimes and their consequences finally settling on his shoulders. The other members of Morrison's crew surrendered without further resistance, their loyalty to their boss evaporating once they realized he could no longer protect them from the consequences of their actions. Years of criminal activity were catching up with all of them, and self-preservation trumped any remaining loyalty. As Morrison was led away toward a federal transport vehicle, he turned back toward Elias one last time. "Those horses should have been mine," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and bewilderment. "They were never yours, Buck," Elias replied. "They belonged to Jake Clearwater, and now they belong to his daughter. All you ever owned was the fear you created." The drive back to his ranch felt like emerging from a nightmare into the warmth of home. Federal agents had offered to escort him, but Elias preferred to make the journey alone, processing the events of the evening and preparing to reunite with his horse family. As he turned into his driveway, he could see lights blazing in the barn and hear voices raised in celebration. The crisis that had threatened to tear apart everything he'd built was over, replaced by the joy of new life and the satisfaction of justice served. Dr. Martinez met him at the barn door with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Perfect timing," the veterinarian announced. "Mother and baby are both doing beautifully. Come meet the newest member of your family." Inside the stall, Willow stood protectively over a tiny chestnut foal with white markings that mirrored her own. The baby was already attempting to stand, its legs wobbling but determined as it sought its first meal. Scout and Ranger watched from nearby, their earlier playfulness replaced by the serious business of being big brothers. Elizabeth Clearwater knelt in the straw beside the new family, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the continuation of her father's legacy. "Dad would have been so proud," she whispered. "He always said Willow had the heart of a champion." Maria approached Elias with a smile that carried more than just relief about the evening's outcome. "Morrison's in federal custody, his operation is shut down, and 15 families are going to get their stolen horses back. But most importantly, this little one came into the world, surrounded by people who love her." As Elias knelt beside the newborn foal, feeling the warmth of new life beneath his hands, he thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A month ago, he'd been a lonely widower going through the motions of living. Tonight, he was surrounded by friends and family, both human and equine, who'd chosen to stand with him against injustice. The bronze star in his pocket felt warm against his chest, a reminder that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it meant charging into enemy fire to save wounded comrades. Sometimes it meant standing up to a bully who thought power made him untouchable. And sometimes it meant opening your heart to love again after loss had convinced you that such risks weren't worth taking. The new foal completed the family that had started with one Barren mare bought for $30 at a livestock auction. Now there were 4 horses who would live free from fear, protected by a community that had rediscovered its courage and a man who'd found his purpose again. As the celebration continued around him, Elias felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him in the straw. She would have loved this moment, the triumph of love over greed, the protection of the innocent, and the proof that even the most broken hearts could heal when they found something worth fighting for. The new fence posts stood straight and strong in the morning sunlight, their fresh cedar scent mixing with the wildflowers that had begun to bloom along the expanded boundaries of Elias's property. Each post represented more than just a boundary marker. It symbolized the secure future he'd built for his family, both human and equine, through courage and the support of a community that had rediscovered its values. 6 months had passed since Buck Morrison's arrest, and the changes in Dry Creek felt like a rebirth. The federal investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise that stretched across 5 states, resulting in the recovery of over 100 stolen horses and the prosecution of Morrison's entire network. The man who'd terrorized the county for 20 years was now serving a 25-year federal sentence, his empire of fear reduced to memories and legal documents. Elias walked the fence line with a satisfaction that ran deeper than simple property ownership. The expansion had been necessary to accommodate his growing operation. What had started as sanctuary for 3 horses had evolved into a legitimate breeding and training facility that was becoming known throughout Texas for its ethical practices and exceptional animals. Willow grazed peacefully in the main pasture, her 4th foal, a spirited filly named Hope, playing nearby with Scout and Ranger, who'd grown into magnificent young stallions. The paint mare had thrived under Elias's care, her breeding producing foals that combined beauty with the intelligence and spirit that had helped them survive Morrison's cruelty. Elizabeth Clearwater had become a regular visitor, officially partnering with Elias to rebuild her father's bloodline using Willow and her offspring. The legal resolution had awarded her ownership of all horses stolen from the Clearwater ranch, but she'd chosen to leave them in Elias's care, recognizing that their healing required the stability he could provide. Dad always said that horses choose their people as much as people choose their horses. Elizabeth had explained during one of her visits. These horses chose you, and they're thriving here. That's what matters most. The partnership had grown into something deeper than just shared ownership of valuable animals. Elizabeth had moved to Dry Creek permanently, taking over management of the business side of the operation, while Elias focused on training and care. Her presence had brought a daughter's love to the ranch, filling spaces in his heart that had been empty since Sarah's death. But the most significant change in Elias's life had been his relationship with Maria Santos. What had begun as friendship forged in crisis had slowly deepened into love, built on mutual respect and shared values. They'd married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by friends and the horses who'd brought them together. Maria had sold her feed store to move to the ranch full-time, but her business skills and community connections had proven invaluable in building their operation. She handled the paperwork, managed client relationships, and brought a warmth to the ranch that made visitors feel immediately welcome. Dr. Martinez had become more than just their veterinarian. He was family now, sharing Sunday dinners and helping with the more challenging aspects of horse breeding and training. His professional expertise, combined with his genuine love for the animals, had been crucial in establishing their reputation for excellence. The ranch now employed 6 full-time workers, all of them former employees of smaller operations that had been victimized by Morrison's criminal enterprise. Giving these men and women stable employment with fair wages and ethical treatment had become one of Elias's greatest satisfactions. Jake Brennan had used the publicity from Morrison's case to build his practice into one of the most respected law firms in the region, specializing in agricultural law and victims' rights. He'd helped establish a legal fund that provided representation for small ranchers facing intimidation from corporate agriculture, ensuring that what had happened to Jake Clearwater would never happen again. The community changes extended far beyond Elias's ranch. Tom Dutton had been removed from office and was serving his own federal sentence for corruption. His replacement, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, had restored integrity to local law enforcement and rebuilt trust between the sheriff's department and the community it served. The ripple effects of Morrison's downfall had touched every aspect of life in Dry Creek. Businesses that had operated under his influence found new freedom to serve their customers fairly. Small ranchers who'd lived in fear of his retaliation began to speak up about problems and work together for solutions. The county commission, freed from Morrison's control, had approved infrastructure improvements that benefited everyone rather than just the largest landowners. But for Elias, the most meaningful changes were the quieter ones that happened within the boundaries of his own heart. The man who'd bought a Barren mare for $30 had discovered that healing sometimes came in unexpected forms. Caring for Willow and her family had taught him that love wasn't diminished by sharing it, it was multiplied. On this particular morning, as he completed his fence inspection and headed back toward the house, Elias felt the kind of contentment that comes from work that matters. The bronze star in his dresser drawer no longer carried only memories of loss and sacrifice. It reminded him that courage could be used to protect and nurture, as well as to fight and defend. The veterinary journal that had guided him through the early days of caring for the foals now shared shelf space with breeding records, training logs, and business documents that chronicled the growth of their operation. His father's wisdom about listening to horses and treating them with respect had become the foundation of a philosophy that attracted clients from across the state. Sarah's garden tools had found new purpose as well. Maria had restored the vegetable garden, but she'd also used the tools to plant flowers around the barn and create beautiful landscaping that made the ranch feel like a true home. The rusted implements that had once symbolized loss now represented growth and renewal. As Elias approached the house, he could smell coffee brewing and hear Maria's voice as she talked on the phone with a potential client. The sounds of a thriving household replaced the echoes of loneliness that had haunted these rooms for so long. Through the kitchen window, he could see the horses in their pasture, Willow keeping watch while her children played, the picture of a family that had overcome adversity to find peace and security. The sight never failed to move him, reminding him of how much had changed since that first morning when he'd found two starving foals at his gate. The property deed in his filing cabinet now shared space with partnership agreements, breeding contracts, and the legal documents that had formally transferred ownership of the recovered horses to their rightful owners or their heirs. The simple piece of paper that had once represented his right to be left alone now anchored a thriving operation that connected him to a community of people who shared his values. But the true measure of what they'd built together couldn't be captured in legal documents or business records. It lived in the trust that shone in Willow's eyes when she approached him for attention, in the confidence that Scout and Ranger showed as they worked with young riders, in the perfect health and happiness of Little Hope as she discovered the world from the safety of her mother's protection. The fence posts that marked the boundaries of his expanded property stood as monuments to more than just successful business growth. They represented the security that comes from standing up for what's right, the prosperity that flows from treating others, human and animal, with dignity and respect, and the peace that follows when justice prevails over corruption. As the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green, Elias Boone stood at his front gate, looking out over everything he'd built and protected. The lonely widower who'd bought a supposedly barren mare 6 months ago had become the patriarch of a thriving family and the anchor of a community that had rediscovered its courage. The horses in his pasture grazed peacefully, their contentment reflecting the security and love that surrounded them. They'd found their way home to each other, across miles of harsh country, guided by instincts stronger than human cruelty or greed. In saving them, Elias had discovered that he'd saved himself as well. Sometimes, the most important journeys begin with the smallest acts of compassion. A $30 bid at a livestock auction had started a chain of events that changed dozens of lives, brought down a criminal empire, and proved that one person's courage could inspire an entire community to remember what justice looked like. The fence posts stood strong and straight, marking the boundaries of home for a family that would never again know hunger, fear, or separation. And in the house beyond the pasture, two people who'd found love later in life were planning a future filled with the satisfaction of meaningful work and the joy of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The mare they'd called Barren had given birth to hope, and hope had taken root in the hard Texas soil to bloom into something beautiful and lasting.